This new year, we cry out to you, the one who restores broken hearts, who refreshes tired spirits, who makes all things new. Let our faith and hope be born again today. Help us to let go of the past, stop looking back, and turn our eyes toward you. We are here today in full acceptance of who we've been, but also in hopeful expectation of who you're shaping us to be. Let your love work in us so you can better work through us. We stand ready to embrace all you have for our lives, ready to do your will, ready to witness the wonders of your mighty hand, ready to share the redeeming love, the perfect grace, the life-changing salvation you have given us. So today, we lift up our voices in praise to the one who washes away our failures, who wipes away our fear and doubt, to the Almighty God who makes all things new.
Right. Well, hey, good morning, church. Last week we began this new series, All Things New, that it is never too late for a new beginning, and it is based on the book of Nehemiah. So we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2 today. We're going to be starting in verse 1 if you want to go ahead and get turned there. Last week we talked about the fact that what makes this book interesting is that Nehemiah was just a regular guy. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a king. He was just a regular, everyday person like you and me that God used to bring hope and restoration to people. So because he was a regular guy, Nehemiah had a boss. Now, his boss was kind of a big deal. He was Artaxerxes, King Artaxerxes, who was the king of Persia at the time, arguably probably the most powerful man in the world at that time. Nehemiah was his cupbearer, which is really just kind of a glorified butler, but he had great influence because he spent so much time with the king. So he was an important guy, lived in the palace because he spent so much time with the king. And so this story that we're going through, the book of Nehemiah, it takes place after the Babylonians had conquered the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, knocked down all the walls, and then carted off a whole bunch of people into captivity back to Babylon. Since that time, the Babylonians had been defeated by the Persians, and so that's why Nehemiah is where he is. He is in what used to be Babylon, but is now Persia, serving the king of Persia. One day, his brother shows up and tells him how things are going back in Jerusalem, and what he hears breaks his heart. What he hears is this, that the people in Jerusalem were not doing well, and in fact, this is what he was told in chapter 1, they were in great trouble and disgrace. And so Nehemiah hears that, and he mourns and fasts and prays about this problem. And he begins praying with a plan in mind, but he's praying about it. He knows right then, and maybe God put it on his heart what he was going to do, but he prayed and fasted about that. So Nehemiah was moved by God to do something about this problem that he heard. And we said last week, as we go through the book of Nehemiah over the next several weeks, there's a constant theme that kind of ties every week together, and it's this, that people's relationship with God is assumed to be the most important thing in their life. That as we go through this book over the next several weeks, each time we meet together here, we should remember that what we're hearing and what we're studying is based on that proposition, that people's relationships with God is the most important thing in their life. It certainly was to Nehemiah, right? So much so that he was willing to risk everything for the most important thing. Risked everything for the most important thing. So he left behind his cushy life, right? He had it made. Living in the palace of the king, working for the king. We talked about last week that he was probably, in terms of influence, the number 2 man in Persia, right? So he wasn't like, just a minimum wage guy. He was kind of a big deal. He had a lot of influence. He had it made. Probably not a better job for him in all of Persia. And yet he left all of that behind for the most important thing. And what he decided to do was give up his influence and his place of comfort to go to people that were in trouble and, as his brother said, in disgrace. And so as we look at today's passage, there's three things that we can take from this, okay? And again, it's based on that premise that people's relationship with God is the most important thing in their life. And so we see three truths in what we're going to look at this morning about our relationship with God. And the first one is this: waiting is important in our relationship with God. Waiting is important. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 and 2. Here's what Nehemiah wrote. In the month of Nisan, the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad? And why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. So Nisan is the first month on the Israelite calendar. It would be equivalent to our late March, early April. Okay, so he's having this conversation with the king, late March, early April. Do you remember last week we talked about when he heard the news, when his brother came to him? He told us when that happened that it was in the month of Kislev, which would be our late November, early December. So we can say there's 4 months have passed since he heard the news, since he had a plan in mind, but he began praying and fasting about it. And now 4 months later, he has the opportunity to talk to the king about what God has put on his heart. And remember, we know from his prayer in chapter 1 that he had that plan in mind because he alluded to it in his prayer. So we have to ask the question, what's taking you so long, right? It was 4 months ago that you heard this bad news and you kind of already had a plan. What were you waiting on? Well, here's where we learn something about our relationship with God. It's two things. Prayerfully, oftentimes we may not get an answer right away. Maybe you've experienced that in your life. I'm the world's worst about it. Not only do I want the answer right then and there, I want the burning bush, I want the handwriting on the wall, I want it to be super clear. God, give me that answer, make it plain, and give it to me now. But evidently that wasn't happening for him. And so he waited prayerfully because oftentimes it takes waiting for us to hear the answer from the Lord. Practically, Nehemiah may have been waiting for just the right time to have this discussion with the king. And again, you've probably experienced that in your life when you've needed to have an important discussion with someone. You don't just barge in there and say, hey, no. You wait for the right time, right place, right? You got to get your right frame of mind to have that conversation. Parents, if you've ever had to have the talk with your kids about sex, you know what I'm talking about, right? That's not a conversation that you just, oh, by the way, let's talk about that. That's not how it works, right? You got to have the right time, the right place, and you got to be in the right headspace to have that conversation, or at least I did. So when I had that conversation with our sons, I picked a soccer tournament to do that. So we had to drive to Memphis, which if you've ever driven there from Tulsa, you know that drive's terrible, right? There's nothing good about that. But I thought, well, we're going to be in the car for a long time on I-40, driving across Arkansas with a captive audience. Ain't nobody getting out of this car, right? So it's perfect time. So I'm driving in my car, and I think, all right, when we get to the Cracker Barrel billboard up there, I'm going to have it. So we're driving, and I passed the Cracker Barrel billboard because I chickened out. But I was like, okay, no, now the McDonald's billboard. When we get to the McDonald's billboard, I'm going to start that conversation. And then I drove past the McDonald's billboard, okay? I did have the talk on the way back, okay? But the point is, it takes the right time and the right place to have an important conversation. Important conversations are just that. They're important. You don't want to just barge into them. And so I very much appreciate the fact that Nehemiah waited, right? That he didn't just barge in, because sometimes timing is everything in these things. So Nehemiah also tells us, though, in verse 2, he was very much afraid. Right? Even though he was like the number 2 guy, he was very much afraid of what was about to happen because Artaxerxes could have interpreted his sadness in his presence as dissatisfaction, right? Dissatisfaction with his job or with the king. Because when it came to the king being in the king's presence, it didn't pay to be a buzzkiller. You needed to be happy and life is good and let me be positive in the king's presence. We know historically that Persian monarchs believed that simply being in their presence would make a person happy. Simply being in their presence, right? Just being around them ought to make you happy. That's how the Persian kings felt. In the presence of the king, everything had to be good and perfect, right? Or you wouldn't be around very long. In fact, it was so ridiculous, again, we have a historical record that anyone who came into the king's presence had to cover their mouth when they talked to the king so you didn't defile the king with your funk breath, right? We have a picture of this happening right here. So you see the man on the right-hand side there talking, that's the king sitting on the throne, and he's covering his mouth lest his bad breath offend the king. The king in this picture is King Darius the Great, who is Artaxerxes' grandfather, okay? So history happening right here. God's story is really what's happening here. So he's worried, right? I can't offend the king when I come and make my request to him. So Nehemiah goes before the king and he makes his request, which takes us to our second point. Praying is important in our relationship with God, okay? That's verses 3-5. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. So Nehemiah had been praying for 4 months about this, right? He told us, I prayed and I fasted about that plan that he had in his mind, about what he felt God was calling him to do. And so he began with a plan in mind. He prayed about it. He fasted about it, but he was waiting for God's timing. And so after waiting for God's timing, he gets the chance to have this discussion. But look back at verse 4 again. He says, the king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Listen, if anyone was prayed up for this discussion, it was Nehemiah, right? He'd been praying for 4 months, praying and fasting, and he already had the plan. It's not like, God, I'm clueless about what you're calling me to do here, so let me pray about it. Maybe it'll give me some clarity. No, he had a plan, and he prayed about it. And yet, it took him 4 months, but now he tells us he prayed again, right? In the middle of the conversation, he prayed. So this wasn't, you know what? Time out, king. I'm going to go over here and let me pray in my prayer closet real quick, and then I'll get back to you based on your question to me of what do I want. No, in the moment, he prayed about it. In the moment, he decided, you know what? This is the time I've been waiting for. Let me ask the Lord for favor here. Let me ask the Lord, what is it that you want me to say here, God? So he prayed, and then he prayed some more. I love nuts in my brownies. How many of you like nuts in your brownies? I know, we're the minority. What's wrong with the rest of y'all, okay? That's the best, okay? The brownie without nuts is okay. Nuts, yeah, walnuts. There we go. So they're okay until you add the walnuts, and then that takes them to another level. But so Sheila, my wife, every time she makes brownies, I have this conversation with her. Sheila, honey, thank you so much for making the brownies. That's exactly how I say it. Listen, when you put the nuts in, just when you think you've put enough in, put some more in, okay? And she gives me that look, and I don't know if she even pays attention to me or not. But what's true for brownies is true for prayer. Just when you think you've prayed enough, put some more in, right? That's what we see happening with Nehemiah. 4 months of prayer, and yet in the middle of the conversation, he prays some more, right? Maybe you've done that before. I've had many conversations where people are telling me something, and in my mind I'm thinking, Lord, I don't know what to do with this, so I need you to guide me here. Do I help? Do I listen? What am I supposed to do with this? And that may have been what he was doing with the Lord, right? King Artaxerxes says, what is it you want? And he's like, wow, what is it that I want? Well, I have a plan, but should I spill the beans here or what, Lord? So Nehemiah prays silently, and then he asks him for letters to all of the rulers, the governors of all the surrounding territories that he has to pass through on the way to Jerusalem. And so all that territory had been conquered by Persia. And then Persia installed governors there, right, that all reported to the king. And so Nehemiah was saying, listen, those guys may have a problem with me going through there, whatever, right? Let's make it easy. Give me letters. That may have been what he was praying about in the conversation. And then he says, and give me lumber to rebuild the gates, right? He went Donald Trump on him. I'm going to build that wall, and you're going to pay for it, king. So maybe that's where God was leading him when he prayed that. But then in the second half of verse 8, he says, and because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So the king granted his request, and God answered his prayers. Nehemiah knew it was not because of his brilliant plan, wasn't because of his amazing pitch, wasn't even because of his fantastic breath, okay? God heard and answered his prayers. Okay, sorry, we're going to do a technical swap. Thank you. Okay, now y'all know I talk with my hands, so this could be bad. We'll see, all right? So the king granted his request. Again, Nehemiah knew not because of his brilliant plan, not because of his amazing pitch, not because of his great breath. God heard and answered his prayer. Again, he'd been praying for 4 months. Not that God only hears long prayers, but in this case, Nehemiah was waiting for an answer. So the last truth we see about our relationship with God is this: people are important in our relationship with God. So that may sound like Captain Obvious's answer, right? Yes, of course. We understand, Dean. People are important to God. They are important to God. But people are important in our relationship with God because God often works through people. In your relationship with God, he may, can, and will use people around you to do what he wants to do, and including you. We see that in the rest of this chapter here, that people are important to our relationship with God. So in Nehemiah 2:10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. These are the bad guys of the story, okay? They're going to keep popping up. And so here's what we need to know about them. Sanballat was from the town of Horon, which is why he's a Horonite, okay? It means he's from that city. That town was in Samaria, okay? Fast forward to your New Testament. Remember the relationship that the Israelites had with the Samaritans? They didn't like each other, okay? Well, Sanballat is one of those people. And the reason why there was that animosity between the Israelites and the Samaritans was because of what's happening here. Not that they're against Nehemiah, but the fact that the Babylonians had pulled all these people out of Israel. They had left a remnant of people there just to take care of the land so it didn't go wild, and the wild animals took over and everything. But then they moved other people from other lands that they had conquered into Israel, okay? And so the remnant of those people intermarried with those other people, and all of a sudden you have the Samaritans. And so in the Israelites' minds, they were not true Israelites. That's why that animosity was happening there. So Sanballat was one of those guys. He was a Samaritan at the time. And so he was more than likely some type of government official because he has some juice here. We can tell that as we read the story. He's got a little bit of power, right? Tobiah the Ammonite, we know, was a government official because Nehemiah tells us. He was from the city of Ammon, which is now the capital of Jordan. So this was east of Jerusalem. Okay, government official. We'll see later that both of these guys were up to no good. And it's probably because they were in charge of this area at the time. And so here comes Nehemiah, who's a threat to them, and they're not going to stand for it. Okay, so Nehemiah heads to Jerusalem. After he's been there 3 days, he takes a ride at night around the city on his donkey. And what he sees is that the wall of the city, which is it's like 1.5 miles long, I think, is broken down everywhere. There's not a piece of wall left standing. And so as he's riding in the night, he sees the burned gates, he sees the walls that are knocked down, the stones that are toppled over. Some of the stones are half buried in the dirt. And Nehemiah sees these as a picture of the people of God there in Jerusalem. That just like the stones, they needed to be reclaimed and restored and renewed. And so that's part of his plan as well. So the next day, right, he took the midnight ride. The next day, he gathers up all the people, the priests, the nobles, all the officials. And then in verse 17, he said, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." So here's what we know. He gets all the people together, all kinds of people together. The priests, the nobles, the officials, goldsmiths, jewelers, perfumers, and then just normal everyday people, right, who probably were just trying to survive. Maybe they were farmers. Maybe they were tradesmen or something like this. But he gets all the people together and tells them the plan. And he says that we need the people of God to accomplish the work of God, that is the will of God. That's how it happens. That God uses all kinds of people. He can and he does. He did it then and he's still doing it today. So God uses all kinds of people to make all things new. That's why people are important in our relationship with God, because God often does work through other people in our lives. Now notice the we in his speech. Okay? He identifies with the people. He's not some guy that came down from headquarters and let me tell you all what to do. You guys are going to do it. I'm not going to do anything. No, he says we need to rebuild the wall. He's become one of them. He left the safety of the palace and has come to this place that is ruled by evil and wicked men. He's put his life at risk. He's left the safety of his cush job in the palace and is putting his life at risk with these other people. Remember, he'd only been there 3 days before he took his ride. We don't know what he was doing those 3. Maybe he was jet lagged, like on the first day, and so that day's off. The other 2 days, who knows? Maybe he was talking to people. Maybe he was wandering around, just scoping things out. But he's only been there 3 days, and yet there's no us and them for him. It's just we. We need to rebuild the wall. We need to do something. So not only was the wall in need of a rebuild, but he could see that the people needed rebirth. Okay, they were beaten down and defeated. You can tell from the tone of Sanballat and Tobiah that they were used to running things there. I'm sure they liked the status quo just the way it was. No need to change anything. It's all good, just like this. We're in charge. We're on top. Everyone else is below us. We like it that way. And so they were a defeated people. No hope, no prospects for better days ahead. They were just simply existing in the rubble of what could be. And Nehemiah saw what could be. So look at how the people responded when Nehemiah shared the plan with them. This is verse 18. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." And so they began this good work. But not everybody's happy, right? Here comes the bad guys again. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Gershom the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. Again, they don't like it. They don't want the change to happen. "What is this you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" And so they're the bad guys, right? Whenever there's a work of God, there are people who will oppose the work of God. This is still true today. It happened to be these guys here, right? And so they're mocking and they're ridiculing. But there's also a threat in there, and the threat is this: are you rebelling against the king? You know what that is? That's, I'm telling Dad. If you don't stop, I'm telling Dad. Because they all basically had the same dad. It was the king of Persia, right? They were some type of government officials in the Persian hierarchy, and they were threatening Nehemiah to, hey, we'll report back to the king that you're trying to rebuild the walls. Now remember, 13 years before this, Ezra had tried to rebuild the walls, but because people, maybe even it was Sanballat and Tobiah, had written letters to King Artaxerxes and said, hey, you got to stop this. And so the king did. He stopped the rebuilding of the wall, which is why the people are just existing there in the midst of this rubble. They probably thought that they could pull it off again, but they didn't know, right, that Artaxerxes had basically blessed it this time. But this was more than a wall for Nehemiah. It represented the city, and the city represented the kingdom of God. Which is why the bad guys are saying, are you rebelling against the king? Because we know what happens when the walls go up. It becomes a city again. They both knew the glory days of Jerusalem, and they knew what happens when the people of God are surrendered to the work of God. God's glory goes forth from that place. And again, they didn't want the boat rocked. They liked it just the way they were. So they're opposing what's happening here. That's what we've been fasting and praying about this week. Right? That Jesus is building his church, and we have a part to play in that. Not just this church, he's building the global church. And so what is it that he wants us to do? How are we to rebuild the wall? What section of the wall do we take to rebuild? Because God is still making all things new. So what's the part he's asking us to play? See, Nehemiah knew that rebuilding a wall was a work of God. It wasn't just rebuilding a wall. Look at his reply to the haters in Nehemiah 2:20. I answered them saying, the God of heaven will give us success. Why? Because it is a work of God. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Nehemiah makes it clear that God was doing this work. It wasn't dependent upon man. Nehemiah and the people were rebuilding the kingdom of God in their day. They weren't just rebuilding city walls. They were actually fulfilling God's promise of the Savior that was to come. Jerusalem would be the stage that God used to announce his Son as the Savior of the world. That the ultimate plan was that Jesus would come to make all things new, to restore that which was broken. And so it is a picture for us of the kingdom that God is still building in our day. His church, right? He builds it. We get to work in it, but he builds it. We are living stones that are being built into a holy community, built on the cornerstone of Jesus. And just like Nehemiah and his people, they had to rebuild using old, broken stones that had been damaged, wood that had been blackened by fire. And God is still building his kingdom today using imperfect things. That's you, and that's me. He chooses to work through things that are broken, that he might make them new. Do you remember what motivated Nehemiah to begin this in the first place, right? He heard that the wall was broken down and the people were in disgrace. The people were in disgrace. And so here, with God's favor on rebuilding the wall, we see God showing grace for his people that were in disgrace. And he's still doing that today for you and for me. In Jesus, we have the true and better Nehemiah, who was safe in the heavenly palace, who left all of that to go into the danger, right? To identify with his people. In Jesus, we have the true and better Nehemiah, who came to us to be one of us, not at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life, to save us and to show us grace when we were in disgrace, to make us citizens of the ultimate city. So we celebrate that today as we take the Lord's Supper together. We remember what's been done to us and for us. And so the ushers are going to begin passing out the elements. And when you receive yours, just hold on to it until everyone has theirs, and then I'll lead us in the taking of the bread and the cup. Now, while you're waiting, take some time to prepare your heart and pray and remember what's been done to make all things new.